Good morning, everyone. My name is Diane Jordan, and I will serve as your moderator today. In my consulting practice and as consulting partner with Dr. Janet Reed, we have delivered unconscious bias content to a range of broadcast media across the country. And finally, I am the chair of the YWCA of Greater Cincinnati. Our mission is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all people. It is that mission that drives us to support this program this morning. I'd also like to introduce my co-host, Curtis Fuller, a veteran local broadcast journalist who has served more than half of his 30-year career as a news anchor for WLWT Channel 5 in Cincinnati. Everybody knows Curtis. He has received more than 300 awards for his excellence in journalism and tireless community service. He is a visible and well-loved member of the media and of our community, and I am so pleased to be working with him today. I'll turn it over to Curtis in just a few minutes. But first, I'd like to give you a little background on this event. The YWCA came together with the Greater Cincinnati Association of Black Journalists and All in Cincinnati because we share a common interest in ensuring that our society gives everyone a fair and equitable opportunity to thrive. We know that local media is critically important for any community, and we know local news outlets in Cincinnati have a desire to give everyone a voice and a face that represents their viewers. So we thought, how can we use the resources of our three organizations to help local news reflect the many faces and voices of color in our region? For instance, we know that local reporters are producing a tremendous amount of content every day and on tight deadlines. Again, we thought if we could tap into our own networks to create a database of local experts that you could turn to quickly when you need a source of any topic. This is what we wanted to do. The three organizations then designed this event to put context around the use of the database and how to work with it. I'd like also to note that while this database is primarily comprised of Black experts, our group plans to continue to update the document with sources of color from the Hispanic, Asian, and Muslim communities, among others. We'll talk more about the database at the end of the program, and we will send you a link up to the database at the end of the program. Finally, I'd like to ask everyone to please, please, please consider this a safe space for themselves and for others, and treat any confidential or personal information that is shared here today with utmost respect. And now over to you, Curtis.
Well, thank you very much, Diane. And I didn't write her intro to me. How kind of you. It is a pleasure to be here this morning. I was thinking as we were preparing for this, here we are 53 years removed from the Kerner Commission, and we're still discussing these type of issues. And so it's important today and moving forward. So for this morning's program, we've put together a group of esteemed panelists, journalists, and local experts to talk about their experiences in local media and how we can improve our skill sets. And we will hear from Dorothy Tucker, our friend and president of the National Association of Black Journalists, who has a few inspiring words about the work and equity and inclusion in local reporting. Then Kyle Enskeep, who is the Local 12 anchor and president of the local NAACP, NABJ, chapter, who will lead a panel discussion with a group of local journalists on what they have learned as Black reporters about covering our local African-American communities. Then our third agenda item is really a discussion between Denisha Porter, director of All in Cincinnati, with community activist Rowley, and DEI expert Jen Ingram, about serving as a media source and how reporters can get the best results from their Black sources. Then we'll wrap up with a few brief words from Kyle, Denisha, and YWCA President and CEO Barbara Perez. let me just add one other housekeeping note for all of those watching. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat and we will pass it along to the panelists. And then also you can post them to us through the YWCA registration page. If we don't have a chance to answer them in this session, we will make sure it gets to those folks and get answers to you. And so now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dorothy Tucker. Dorothy?
Thank you, Curtis. And good to see you again. Really good to see you again. We were together about 3 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Cincinnati, so still looking good. And thank you guys for having me. I want to thank everybody for being here and joining in a discussion about diversity in America's newsrooms. Shortly after I became president of NABJ, I received an email with a really startling subject line. It said "Inward" published on front page. Obviously, that caught my attention. That email came from Jeffrey Dale, who was an editor at the Patriot Ledger in Quincy, Massachusetts. The front page story concerned a man threatening African-American neighbors with a gun and spouting racial slurs. When the piece read, the entire inward was spelled out. Jeffrey, as I said, who was a copy editor at the time, was livid. He complained to his editors, but he was told that the decision to print the slur had already been made. It was in that moment that Jeffrey recognized what the National Association of Black Journalists has been shouting about since its founding in 1975. Diversity and inclusion matter, and it's about more than having Black and brown reporters. It's about having people in decision-making capacities who are sensitive to issues regarding communities of color. Jeffrey told me that at the time, 100% of the editors at the Patriot Ledger were white, as were the vast majority of the journalists in the newsroom. What really disturbed him is that at that time as well, the country was experiencing a wave of hate crimes in communities across America, yet his editors still chose to print that word. Jeffrey quit the paper in protest. By the way, Jeffrey is white and Jewish, yet he immediately chose to put himself in the shoes of the African-American readers who would see the story. He said to his editors, "If you will do it to their community, you will do it to my community." He quit on the spot, refusing to be part of an organization that would choose to ignore the warnings of someone who cared about journalistic integrity, fair representation, and who tried to prevent the use of offensive or racist language in print. Jeffrey's quitting did spark change. The paper later used asterisks for the offensive term and another version of the story. I'm sorry that Jeffrey had to quit his job to take a stand, but I applaud his commitment to our craft and his respect for communities of color. Right before the pandemic, NABJ conducted a survey on job satisfaction. Early results showed that 77% of respondents believed that they had experienced racial discrimination in the workplace. More than 60% reported they had experienced racism or racist comments while reporting or working on a project. Those stats are depressing. This industry has been talking about doing better for years. In 1978, the American Society of News Editors pushed the industry to reach racial parity in newsrooms by 2000. In 2019, however, the association said, "The racial diversity of newsrooms does not come close to the fast-growing diversity in the US population as a whole." And there have been numerous reports noting that companies that fail to embrace diversity and inclusion will not thrive in a diverse America. That goes for news organizations that have an obligation to produce accurate, fair, and sensitive reporting. I suspect that you're sitting there kind of thinking, well, what about 2020 and the racial reckoning that swept this country after the murder of George Floyd? NABJ was at the center of that storm, and I had a front row seat. The executive members of our board met via Zoom with CEOs, publishers, and managers from more news outlets than I can remember. They all promised to do better, and some of them did. Those are the headlines that you've seen: historic appointments, hires, and promotions of Black journalists around the country. We applaud those who have shown a commitment to embrace journalists of color, particularly Black journalists. We continue to challenge those who made public bold public statements and have fallen disappointingly short. A commitment to improving diversity is really nothing more than respect for the community you cover and claim to serve. Through the stories we tell, we, the media, help influence how viewers and readers perceive people of color, especially Black people. According to an American Values study, 75% of white Americans report social networks that are entirely comprised of people from the same racial or ethnic background, which means at the end of the day, we have the power to help shape how viewers and readers feel, how they react, and how they treat Black people. A couple of years ago in Flint, Michigan, there were 3 Black candidates running for local office. 2 of them had misdemeanor records that were more than 10 years old. When the local paper did the story, they ran their mugshots instead of their candidate's photo on their digital site. It was the epitome of disrespect. Of course, it was a big stink. The paper eventually removed the mugshots and apologized. The use of mugshots is one way the media has contributed to the negative stereotypes of Black Americans as criminals and made viewers and readers fear Black teens and Black men. Some newsrooms have adopted policies to reduce the use of mugshots. Mugshots is a move I hope will become the norm in all newsrooms. That is one way to combat negative stereotypes. Another is to balance the bad. And we can do that very easily by including people in our stories as main characters who just happen to be Black, or showcasing Black professionals who are experts on a topic. Every newsroom should have a directory of Black experts that they can call for a range of subjects. If not, start one, and you will hear a lot more about that throughout this morning. Another way to make a difference is to correct misconceptions by reporting the facts. A few months ago, when 8 women were killed in an Atlanta spa, and 6 of them were Asian, we started seeing a number of stories about attacks on Asians. The videos were horrific. Many of them pictures of Black assailants harming Asian victims. I'm not saying that we don't show the videos. They were needed to highlight Asian violence and anti-Asian hate. But the vast majority of the criminals in the videos were Black. So the assumption from the public is that most of the acts of hate were committed by Black assailants. And that is not true. What needed to be included in those stories are stats from research like the University of Michigan, and I'm quoting. When the media identified the race of the offender, the majority of the perpetrators of anti-Asian harassment were reported to be male and white. There is a history of conflict between the Asian and Black communities. We as journalists must be careful not to perpetuate the negative stereotypes that fuel racial tensions. Diversifying the elite units in our newsroom will also improve coverage of the communities of color. In Chicago, the majority of City Hall reporters are white males. Last spring, Mayor Lori Lightfoot issued a statement saying she would only talk to journalists of color on the anniversary of her inauguration. It was for one day. In a statement, NABJ said that our history of advocacy does not support excluding any bona fide journalists from one-on-one interviews with newsmakers, even if it is for one day in support of activism. But this is where we took some heat, and I'm okay with that. We wrote, and I continue, although we cannot support the tactic, we applaud the mayor's sensitivity to the lack of diversity among the people who cover city government. Historically, America's elite political units have been led by predominantly white reporters and managers. Too often, Black journalists are not given the opportunity to join political teams. Let me share one story of a Black reporter who sometimes covers the mayor, but is not in the City Hall press corps. During the pandemic, one City Hall reporter would be assigned to attend the news conference. You had to text or email the reporter if you wanted a question asked. During the protests, there was looting across the city. This Black reporter had learned that a group of white police officers, majority white police officers, assigned to a predominantly Black South Side neighborhood were seen having coffee in a politician's office and ignoring the chaos. The reporter wanted the City Hall reporter, who happened to be white, to ask the mayor about the incident, but the question was not asked. When the Black reporter later called the City Hall reporter, he told her that he didn't think it was as important as some of the other questions about the protest and looting, so he skipped it. 2 weeks later, that story appeared in one of the headlines of the newspaper, and it became a huge story about the police response to looting in the Black community. It could have been out there earlier. When we lack diversity, we run the risk of missing important stories. Increasing diversity also helps avoid the missteps that we've seen in newsrooms around the country. One of the most egregious acts was at KATV in Little Rock. A few weeks after a Black anchor started working at the station, a Black mammy doll appeared on a desk next to hers. Shortly after that, someone in the newsroom shared a doctored photo of the mayor in a compromising position with a woman. They put the photo on the newsroom's Slack channel. In response, the newsroom went through racial and cultural sensitivity training. Just 3 weeks after the training, though, the weatherman and one of the co-anchors put in an Afro wig on air to celebrate 70 degrees weather. The Black community was insulted by that mockery. NABJ joined the chapter to meet with corporate leaders. We learned that all the newsroom managers were white, and out of more than 40 people in the newsroom, only 8 were Black. We were also told that the station had a history of racist incidents that had been ignored by news managers. After a series of meetings, I am pleased to say that the Slack channel, and this is people at Sinclair making this decision, was taken down. And the station is offering another round of sensitivity training to the staff. The talent was suspended for about 3 weeks. The news director was fired, and another news director was hired just a few days ago, as a matter of fact, and she is a member of NABJ. It helps to have someone of color in the room, at the table, and offering a cultural perspective and sensitivity that the majority may not have. It is also important that the majority listens, embraces diverse voices, and is sensitive to language or images that are culturally offensive. Remember Jeffrey I was telling you about? I'm happy to say that Jeffrey found another job in Boston. But Jeffrey's story is a lesson for all of us. It tells us that diversity and inclusion are not just about bodies and seats. It tells us that it's about a mindset. It's about establishing a newsroom culture that cares about all of its employees and the communities that they serve. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. We appreciate your keynote. And now we are going to move to Kyle Inskeep, who is going to introduce our panelists.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. I'm going to ask that the other members of this powerhouse panel, as I am calling them this morning, go ahead and turn their cameras on so I can see all of their faces. For those of you who don't know me, as Miss Diane just said, my name is Kyle Inskeep, and I am the president of the Greater Cincinnati Association of Black Journalists. My day job is that I am an anchor and reporter at Local 12 right here in Cincinnati. And I just want to say thank you to everyone across all the different media organizations here in Cincinnati that are up early on a Saturday morning and making a commitment to diversity within your newsroom. So thank you for coming. And I'm going to ask each of my panelists to just briefly introduce themselves and say where they are working. And if you feel comfortable, how long you have been in the Cincinnati market. I'm going to start with my good friend, Miss Ashley Kirkland.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ashley Kirkland. I am an anchor reporter at WLWT News 5 with Curtis Fuller, and I've been here in this market for about 3 years now.
We're going to go now to one of her colleagues, Miss Jamila.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamila Batchelor. I am a producer at WLWT, and I have been there 7 years.
Next, Miss Whitney Miller.
Hello, I'm Whitney Miller. I work at WCPO, and I'm a reporter. I've been in Cincinnati 2 years now as of Thursday. So, you know, how y'all doing? Good morning.
Good morning to you, Whitney, and thank you for bringing some energy, and happy anniversary to you as well. Next, Mr. Kevin Aldridge.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kevin Aldridge. I'm the opinion and engagement editor at the Cincinnati Enquirer, and I have been in the Cincinnati market off and on for the past 20 years.
Incredible, incredible. Next, my boss, Mr. Tim Garrity.
Morning, thanks, Kyle. My name is Tim Garrity. I've been the news director at Local 12 and Star 64 now for a little short of 6.5 years.
Wonderful. And last but certainly not least, is Rob Williams with us? I know Rob was had another engagement, but he was going to pop over. I see he's still on here, but I don't see his camera. But Rob Williams is one of the evening anchors at Fox 19. He is also going to be part of this panel. I think he's going to be popping in just a moment. So my first question is kind of a broad one to the entire panel specifically. And the question is, where do newsrooms in general, I'm not talking about any specific newsroom, I'm talking about the industry, I guess, as a whole. But where do newsrooms in general fall short when it comes to coverage of the Black community, Black issues, and representation of Black people? So anyone can take this question.
I would like to jump in. Hello. I think one of the things is I think in newsrooms, we're kind of afraid, or we tiptoe around like calling a spade, like when something is clearly racism, we try to find some fancy, softer, easier word for the viewer to take in instead of just calling it exactly what it is. And I think even in our editorial meetings, we're afraid to have those conversations and really call what it is, and then make a plan to cover it in a way where people are not just being sugar-coated and spoon-fed something that is tiptoed around. If that makes sense, I hope it does.
It does, and I think there's been a change definitely after we saw what we went through last year. And then for the first time, because we would say, well, someone would call this racist, or this would be considered racist behavior. But now we're saying, no, this is racist.
And even in how we describe, I think this changed in 2020, how we describe a riot or a protest, like, is it actually that, instead of just blanketing protesters, calling them, looters or something like that. It's just really being careful with placing these generalizations on Black people.
Exactly. Kevin, you look like you were about to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, one of the things that I notice is how African Americans tend to not show up in non-stereotypical ways in news coverage. I think, news organizations can do a better job of showing African Americans showing up in everyday ways, as business owners, as parents, as, and not always necessarily when it pertains to particularly racial issues or sports or crime related type things. I think that there are plenty of hardworking everyday African Americans who are doing exceptional things in our communities, and they're not showing up in everyday ways that you might see other communities showing up in media coverage. And so I think getting more away from the stereotypical types of coverage that we see, consulting Black experts, not just when it's stories completely about race or racial conflict, I think are ways that we can get better. I think when we start showing up in everyday normal ways that are not just because we're Black, but because we're a part of the community, I think we'll know we've achieved some success.
And I think that's the whole goal of this training, the whole goal of this initiative, the whole goal of this source list, is to see Black and brown people depicted in stories that don't deal specifically or exclusively with the Black experience, as Kevin was just mentioning there. And I have a question. I think, Ashley, I'm going to point this directly to you, because as a reporter, walk me through your process when it comes to thinking about who you are going to include in a story. Because I feel like, and correct me if you don't feel this way, but as a Black reporter, I'm very intentional about looking at who I'm interviewing for stories, and going out and finding other Black and brown people or people from minority communities that I can bring in to my stories. Do you do the same?
Yeah, so, and I want to piggyback off of what Kevin was saying. This past year, COVID was the topic, and we did so many stories with businesses that were, failing, or businesses that were having hardships. And it wasn't until you started talking about maybe African-American businesses that you got those Black business owners. And that's an issue. There are Black business owners every day, not just when the issue is highlighted on, or the spotlight is on the Black community. And the President Tucker talked about the statistics of people that, you know, you hang with. And I find that when you don't have diverse groups that you hang with outside of work, you may not know, or you may not be comfortable going to those voices when it's time for a story. But for me, when I'm doing a story, sometimes I'll know someone off the top of my head because of the circles that I'm in the city, or where I have hosted events or been involved in different charities. But other times, if I don't know, I can ask my colleagues. I find it comfortable to do that. But also, I know that there is the African American Chamber. I know that there are different organizations that represent people that have diverse voices in the African American community. But I also, just as a Black woman, I know that Black people are out here doing excellent things. So for instance, I had a story about infant mortality in Ohio, and we talked to a professor at UC. So I went to the UC database. I didn't know, actually it was Jamila, our producer, that went and found one of the Black professors. We didn't know this person, but we knew that there had to be an expert voice on Black infant mortality at UC. I myself is an African-American minor at Indiana University, so I knew UC must have had to have a program like that. So it's really just about branching out, and for someone outside of the Black community, getting outside of your comfort zone personally, because you can't always go to the same store owners, the same places. You know, I did a story 2 years ago about Cincinnati becoming one of the fastest growing cities for young Black entrepreneurs. So you cannot tell me there are not Black businesses here in Cincinnati that you can go to when you're talking about struggles during the pandemic. So you just have to think outside of the box of your comfort zone, for sure.
It all goes back to being intentional. And Jamila, do you want to speak to that story that you all worked with Ashley, and why it was so important for you to be intentional and to find that expert that could speak to Black women and infant mortality?
Sure. So in particular, that story, we were looking at the Black infant mortality rates because the rates are so high. And part of that included looking at the history and how all of this started. And like Ashley said, like all of us have been to college, so you know there has to be some sort of expert in these different areas. So I knew there has to be some Black professor who can talk to the history of Black infant mortality. And he was actually really great. And this was something that he said went all the way back to slavery. So like Ashley said, like, it's just, you have to branch out a little bit and look for sources in different areas. And while I have the floor, if I could, just to piggyback off of what Kevin said about, you know, those stereotypical stories when it comes to the Black community. Like, one of the things that I necessarily do not like is if there's a story about poverty, we automatically associate that with Black people. And that's not necessarily the case. Like, I know plenty of well-to-do Black people. So poverty and Black people are not synonyms. So that's one of the things that I pay attention to when reporters come back. You know, another thing, like, if you think about all the viral interviews that have gone out there on YouTube that people love to watch, that they think are hilarious, is usually a Black person who necessarily may have missing teeth or different things like that. And it's just like, those are the type of things, like, I pay attention. When someone comes back with video, I'm looking at, who did you interview? You know, when you went to go do this story about, you know, the free store food bank distribution, did you only interview Black people? Because I'm pretty sure there weren't just Black people in line for that distribution. So I think that's always important, to not associate poverty with Black people.
And Jamila, I want to stay on this topic for just a moment, because you are a producer, right? And I think that is an important part here, is because we don't have a lot of Black producers at every station in Cincinnati, and we need to see more Black producers. We need to see more Black managers. We need to see more Black GMs, because these are the conversations that you can have with those reporters, correct?
Absolutely. And I think sometimes as a producer, you may feel like, okay, well, you know, I don't have the reporter title to my name, but at the end of the day, you're still a journalist. And you can be in these spaces with reporters and anchors and have these conversations and not feel like you're not on that level. Because like I said, you're just as much as a journalist as a reporter or an anchor.
How do you have those conversations with your reporters or other people when you see them come back and you say, hey, maybe this isn't the way that this story should be depicted, because I think we may have some people on this call who are going to now leave here and look at their rundowns, look at their stories differently, or there may be a manager and they may look at a reporter's story differently, but not know how to have that conversation. What is your advice to someone doing that?
I think it is a hard conversation to have because sometimes people just don't know, and they didn't necessarily go out that day to say, okay, I'm going to interview all the Black people for this story that I'm doing about poverty. But it's an important conversation to have. So it doesn't have to be a conversation that you necessarily bring a manager into, because that makes the person feel like they're in trouble or something's going to happen. But I mean, you can pull them to the side and say, hey, maybe next time we get more variety of sources when we do this story. So I just think it's how you approach the person and use it as a teaching moment.
Exactly.
If I can hop in on that. I just think that the newsroom should be a safe space as well for Black reporters, producers, managers to be able to say those things. I know in my newsroom, I'm not afraid to speak up. If I think something is, I mean, obviously it's in your delivery, but if I think something is off, I'm not afraid to say it. And I think newsrooms you need to feel like in your newsroom you can say something and it's not an attack. And I think that's the problem. A lot of people feel like, there's a lot of Black reporters or a lot of Black employees in these newsrooms feel like if I say something, now they're going to feel like, oh, this Black girl said something and now they're afraid of you or whatever. And like, you shouldn't have to feel like that in your workspace.
Whitney, to you, what makes a newsroom a safe space for Black employees?
See, I am a anomaly sometimes, I think, because I'm just gonna say what's on my mind. And I think a safe space is where the managers say, hey, you know, we welcome your opinion. We want to hear from you. When they seek out your opinion, especially about Black stories, about the community, I think that lets them know it's okay and that your opinion is valid and valued. Making your employees feel valued is very, very important. I think all newsrooms can work on that. I mean, it's just, all races need to feel valued, but the Black community, like I need to be able to feel like I can say something to my peer and my managers about how something is covered.
Anyone else want to add anything, Kevin?
Yeah, hey, Kyle, if I could kind of jump in on that, and I agree with everything that's been said, and I wanted to kind of jump on something that you had talked about earlier about sort of this lack of presence that we have, whether it's producers, whether it's upper level managers or decision makers. I think you have to draw upon all of the diversity that you have in your news organization, whether they're at the top or at the bottom, because I think a lot of times in executive leadership positions, there may only be one African American or one person of color maybe in that decision-making team, but you might have more diversity at the reporting ranks or whatever. I think you got to involve all of those people in the conversation, because even amongst us as minorities, there's diversity of thought. So there may be things that I may not be sensitive to because I may be Black of a certain socioeconomic status and it just doesn't resonate with me like it might somebody else who may not be in my position. So I think, Black people are not a monolith of thought. And so even when you just have one representative and you think you've solved the problem, that's really not accurate. You have to pull in the fullness of the diversity that you have in your newsroom. And I think that, the more people that you can involve, the more voices that you can get involved, the more you can make sure that you're being sensitive and accurate and complete in the context that you're providing. So I just wanted to throw that in there, because just because there's one of us in the room doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to solve everything.
Can I add to that as well? That's a really important point there, Kevin, because you can have one and we're not a monolith, but really it's about culture of a newsroom. And we've all been in newsrooms where the culture is what drives the content, and they care about certain things. They care about certain events that happen throughout the year. They don't care about other things. And that comes from the top down. So I think that we really have to have managers who care about what the culture of the workplace is going to be. And we had these important conversations last year during the protests and everything, but those conversations need to continue, and it needs to say that we're going to be a culture that cares about all aspects of what make up this country. And a lot of that are diverse voices. They're the non, stereotypical non-white voices. They are an anomaly of things that make up the United States of America. And it's especially the region that you are serving, whether you're Cincinnati, Chicago, you have to care about just more than one part of that city represents that city.
Also, I think managers have to care more about, like, just because you love the Potato Fest doesn't mean that the city of Cincinnati all agree that that's the thing that's going to be the most important thing. And I'm just saying Potato Fest. I really don't know if there's a Potato Fest, but you know what I'm saying? It's just like, just because you went to something, you're from Cincinnati and you went there every year of your life is not the experience that everyone in Cincinnati has. And so, like, leaning into having a diverse newsroom, having all those different cultures there represented is important, because then that's how you know what else is happening around and what else is important to other people. Because I know we've done coverage, all the stations have done coverage about things, and I'm like, I don't know that Black people care about this. And that's something to be thought about. Maybe we're not hitting those things as hard, and maybe we need to look at what is it that Black people care about in this community.
If I can jump in as well, because I know I'm the one news director amongst this group. I know there are other managers on the call, and I can only speak obviously for what we at Local 12 try to do, and what I try to do as a manager and leader is, to your guys' point, I do try to draw on diverse voices. Kyle and I discuss stories and ideas all the time, as I do with a variety of employees in the newsroom and so on. But I think what I would say though is that for those of you who participated in, we call them content calls, other stations still call them editorial calls or meetings, make sure you're voicing those things while the decisions are being made. Because oftentimes we will always talk about, is there a better story out there? Are there other stories we should be covering? And I can't tell you the number of times we hear crickets chirping or silence when we ask for other ideas or people to weigh in and so on. Now, somebody who, and I know there are a bunch of Local 12 news employees on this call, if any of you don't feel like it's safe to talk, I want you to come see me Monday and tell me that, because I believe that our content calls should be, and I think every manager in this call wants to believe that their calls are safe places for any employee to talk about concerns, other ideas, their thoughts on a topic and so on, so we can make sure every day we are putting the most diverse set of stories on the air, and then within those stories, talking to as diverse a set of people as we can.
And Tim, while I have you, I want to ask you a specific question, because this is something that you and I have discussed. So what is the best way to respond to complaints or controversies regarding issues of race and representation in news coverage? And I'm asking you this question specifically because we've had some issues at Local 12. And what have you learned from the experiences that we have had at Local 12?
Well, I'll describe two, and you and I have discussed these. These both have occurred within the last 6-7 months. One viewer emailed us and was upset that in a 9 a.m. segment, we did a story on picnics. And this viewer told us that a lot of Black Americans connected the word picnic to lynchings. And that led to I think a very emotional, but a very powerful discussion within our newsroom, because there were people who knew this, people who didn't know this, and there were Black employees who knew this and didn't know this, and white employees who knew this and didn't know this. One of our assignment editors, Michaela Boyd, jumped in, I think that same day or next morning, said, I studied this issue in college. What if we took all this discussion and turned it into a story to educate both our newsroom and our community about the connection of picnics to lynchings? So she not only researched the story, wrote the story, and she said, well, can I report the story? Sure. And so we ended up putting that story on the air, I think about 3 weeks ago, as a way to educate ourselves and our community about something. I think before that viewer email came in, I don't think any of us would have ever reported on that topic. The other one was a little more personal in that I would say a couple months before that, one of our digital editors had posted a picture, I believe it was for International Women's Day, that showed all of our on-air women at a point in time where we did not have a Black woman on air. And honestly, in that situation, we acknowledged the issue. It did not look good. We engaged in meaningful discussions both in the community, both the journalistic community as well as with the Cincinnati community, and we responded. And I'm happy to say that today our staff on air and off air is more diverse. Are we satisfied with where we are now? No. But the point is that, we've made some good start and we will continue to grow down that line. What I learned, Kyle, in both cases is that you really have to truly listen. One of the things that I try to tell, folks when they ask me about advice, if they're going to be a manager and so on, is that you can't be thinking about what you're going to say before the other person has a chance to finish talking, because then you're not actively listening to them. You actually have to listen to them. And frankly, there are times where I will pause because I'm not sure what I want to say back because I am processing still what that person said. And I will sometimes say, give me a minute to respond. The other part of that is you have to take meaningful action. Telling somebody you're going to do something and then not do it is meaningless. So if you say you're going to do something, you need to do one of two things. Do it. Or if you can't do it, go back to that person or whomever you've told you're going to do it and explain why you can't do it or when you are going to be able to do it.
Following this call, people may feel more empowered to have these conversations with their white colleagues about maybe you didn't cover this issue of race in the correct manner. People may take that the wrong way. What is your reaction to what is your advice to someone who may be getting some criticism on how they're covering issues of race, how they're covering issues of culture for the first time, for that person who's going to be getting that criticism for the first time?
I would say again, I think they need to be open and listen. And what I would hope is for the employee who's going to go and have the discussion with their coworker or manager and so on, that the spirit of that is not an attack, but it's to make the content decisions better and the people we talk to, the diversity of our voices we choose better in the future. If that's how a coworker is coming to me or to appear with that kind of point, I would really hope that the coworker's response would be to actively listen and understand what that person's trying to say and figure out what the right path is moving forward. I mean, sometimes, let's be honest. I mean, the two situations I described, it's tough realizing sometimes that you did something that doesn't necessarily put you in the best light. But I've also learned sometimes you make some of your greatest successes through some of your greatest either missteps or failures or, times where, the reality doesn't reflect the way you want it to be. And so you have to accept that and just be open and ready to accept that feedback.
I want to open this back up now to everyone, because as we have these conversations, we've all been in editorial meetings where someone has said something as you're talking about an issue of race or culture, and you just are like, we should not have ever said that, right? For me, it's when people say blacks. I hate it. I don't ever want to hear it again. Just don't say blacks. Let's have a conversation about things that people should avoid, and they may be well-intentioned. They may just be uninformed. So talk to me about things that people should not say when we're having these hard conversations about race in a newsroom.
Kyle, I want to jump in because I know that could be confusing to people, because saying like the blacks is different from calling me a black woman, because I prefer to be a black woman. But saying like blacks, as in plural, that's more offensive. Am I correct to what you're saying?
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Fair.
don't say that. That's the one I don't like.
Kyle, I also have an issue, and I've brought this up, and it goes back to the point I made previously, is when we use terms like the African American community, like who exactly does that encompass? It lumps all Black people into one big bunch, and we don't do that we do that with minority communities, but we don't do that with the general community at large. And so I think as specific as you can be about who you're talking about when it comes to minority groups. Is it people who live in a certain neighborhood, people associated with a particular group? Be specific. Don't just lump all Black people into one category when you say the African American community. And it's difficult for us, when you work in print media and you have an economy of words, we take shortcuts sometimes that make, generalizations that are not necessarily healthy and present pictures that are not entirely accurate. So that's one of the things that I kind of harp on, in my workplace, is how can we be more specific about who we're talking about and not lump minority groups into one particular community.
And I think you could just also say, how many times have you written the white community or said the white community? We don't say that. I think when we talk about white people, we might say that this is a German person. I mean, we break it down for them. And I think what you're saying is correct. Lumping that community into a generalization sometimes is just, it's kind of lazy. And we need to work, like you said, to try to be as specific as possible.
I would have to say black on black crime. Like Whitney said, we don't say white on white crime. There is no such thing. Like, it's crime. So that's like one of the main things that I do not want to hear when we're discussing anything, because most crime happens between people who know each other. So,
right. And if you're not going to back that up with a statistic and show where, you know, this black on black crime is the most, you know, it's like, it's crime. You are so right, Jamila.
Whitney, you gave me an aha moment there when you said we don't say white community. That was just like a light bulb went off, like, hold up. And that perfectly illustrated the point that we're talking about here.
Yeah, we don't. I think somebody in the comments is saying we call it the majority, which is true. And I just feel like it all boils down to just respect. You know, I feel like the white community, since we're using that today, gets a lot of respect, and it's just second nature. Nobody's thinking about it, but you know, it's just like, it is what it is. But we just need to give every race respect, and I think that's what Black people are looking for. Just with the whole movement from 2020 and beyond, we just want respect. And if you wouldn't want this said about your family, your heritage, speaking of white people, if you wouldn't want these generalizations spoken about your family and your heritage, then you just have to think a little bit harder when you're working. And I know we move fast in news, but slow down for just a second and be delicate with a community that you may not know much about.
The next question, Rob, I want to direct this to you starting out, and then anyone can hop in. Why is it important for non-Black journalists? We have a whole group of non-Black journalists on this call today, about 90 people. Again, thank you all for coming. But why is it important for non-Black journalists to also report on issues of race and culture in Cincinnati or in any market across the country, and not leave it to just Black reporters?
Couple of things. Thanks for organizing this, because I feel the power as a Black journalist, right? Never did I think 20 years ago that I would commune with other Black journalists and talk about the issues that affect us. So I'm super thankful for that. When we talk about like racial injustice, when we talk about racism, when we talk about access to quality education or healthcare, these are not Black issues. These are issues that transcends race. And I think collectively as a newsroom, it's important that we take steps to understand each other. And that includes white journalists covering the protests from last summer. That includes straight people covering issues that affect the LGBTQ community, because I think that makes us better as a newsroom and better servants for what we are designed to do. The thing is like, sometimes I think we forget that our profession is stated in the founding fathers, right? Like a free and fair press, right? That's what we do. And for us to cover our community in a thoughtful way is super important, right? And the thing is like, we are not carpetbaggers, right? We're not people on the internet who does not care about our community. We live in this community and we care about it. And it's important that we cover it in a thoughtful way. And that goes back to covering issues that seemingly does not concern us, right? So Black journalists covering seemingly white issues and white journalists covering seemingly Black issues, because collectively it's important that we cover these issues thoughtfully. And we all need to have skin in this game. You know what I mean? I think that's super important. And I think as long as we cover issues thoughtfully, it doesn't matter what our skin looks like. It doesn't matter who we love. It just doesn't matter.
because we all have skin in this game. And I think it's important that we realize that.
Well, exactly. Thoughtfully, I think is the key word. Thoughtfully and with intention. Whitney?
And just checking your biases at the door when you get ready to report. But I do think it's important for white journalists to cover communities of color. One journalist that does a really, really, really great job at my station is Lucy May. She is always talking to different minority groups, and she gives people grace, and she comes with compassion when she reports. And so that is, I think, a great model for how a white journalist should enter into doing a story with someone of color. Lucy May is com.
And Whitney, I'm going to back you up on that. That's the reason why a newsroom should reflect the community, because if there's an issue that I don't understand, I can turn to someone in the newsroom and say, like, what you think about this? You know what I mean? Give me some perspective on this. And then we increase our understanding of the communities we serve, and that makes us better journalists, thus making more money for the companies that we serve, right? the thing is, like, it's better for business, it's better for our community, and that's what we should all strive for. I think the business that we do is on a higher level, and we should always remember that, because we provide a service to the people of this community in which we live. So it's more important that we are thoughtful about what we do.
Kyle, can I add something to the conversation?
Absolutely, Ms. Dorothy, take it away.
The one thing that I think is important is that, what I find is that the reporters, the white reporters especially, because they are in the streets, because they are doing the job every day, because they're assigned around the area, for the most part, they get it, and they do bring, a certain amount of sensitivity and understanding because they're interacting. What I'd almost like to see is the managers who are inside, those who are making the assignments. In my opinion, they need to also get out of the newsroom, because what happens is they live in their suburban bubble or their northwest side of the city bubble, and they come in to work every day in the city, and they're the ones who decide. They edit the stories, they decide which stories, they decide the placement of the stories, they decide the importance of the story. But what they're bringing is a world that is their bubble. So, my challenge now is to say to those producers, to those mid-level managers, to those editors, you need to get out. You need to understand that, and I'll use this example in Chicago, and this is what I've said to people, my managers in Chicago, there's a big thing about the Obama Library, all these stories that have become national stories about how the people there are concerned about rent control, concerned about the community changing and not being able to afford the rents anymore. And, I said to them, if you go out and you see, because you've never seen, you're writing voiceovers, you're writing little stories about this, and you're telling folks to cover it, but you haven't been out there. If you go out there, you will understand that it's not just about the rents. It's about losing, it's about losing their community. It's about being forced to move because you can't afford the rents, because they are literally 4 blocks from the lake where their children play, because they can walk outside of their apartments and catch a bus. They can go 2 blocks and catch a train. They can get to a neighborhood where there's not a food desert, but if you don't understand literally where that place is, you don't come with that. So I've challenged them to just wake up on a Saturday morning and go to a neighborhood that you've written about. Go to a neighborhood that you don't know anything about. Go to an arts festival on the south side of Chicago, and if you live on the south side, then go up to the north side, and go to some event. Get out of your bubble so you can understand what those reporters that you are sending out into the community, the why behind it. and you can really understand what they're seeing and why, you know, and why they're writing the way they are.
Well, Dorothy,
They do.
so what Dorothy is saying is what I'm saying in terms of white journalists covering so-called Black stories. You need to get outside your bubble. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't matter what group you're in, you need to get outside of your bubble to better cover the communities that you serve.
Yeah.
I'm in agreement with Dorothy. She's right on the money.
And because here's the thing, and I think this is something that, you know, and I'm going to challenge Black reporters to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And we you know, quite honestly, we have to do the same thing. You know, I literally, during the pandemic, I thought if I walk my neighborhood one more day and see the same house, I'm just going to shoot myself. You know, you know, so what did you do? So we literally, my daughter and I literally said, you know what? There are 77 communities in the city of Chicago.
Yeah.
So we started getting up, driving to some community we'd never been to before, and walking that community. You know, and stumbling across restaurants and little boutiques and little pop-ups and stores and whatever it was, you know, so that we too got out. And, you know, when you get out and see something that's not your world, that's how you learn. That's where you find those resources. You walk in the door, start asking questions, and they go out. So you're a reporter. And then you get that phone call the next time something happens.
Yeah.
Hey, did you know? And that's why we do what we do.
But you know what, Kyle, that's part of the job as journalists. If our job is supposed to be covering and accurately reflecting our communities. And if we're not covering our cities in their entirety, then we're not telling the full story or giving the complete context of what's going on. And I think, you know, our inability to get out, as Dorothy and others have said, to completely cover all aspects of our community means we're not telling the full story of what's happening in our communities. So we're leaving things incomplete. And until we understand that if we aren't getting out into these areas that we're not covering and talking to people and covering things that we haven't been, then we're not fully giving our readers or viewers the complete story about what's happening where they live.
Actually, you can try to say something. I want to make sure we get to you.
Oh, me? Okay, sorry. I do want to give kudos to our managers. Last year, we did this whole thing where we covered 52 neighborhoods of Cincinnati, and we told stories every week on the different communities of our area. But when there is not that concerted effort as journalists and as reporters, you have to be curious. And I don't think anyone gets on these editorial meetings and say, I'm covering the white issues today, but listen, that those things that you often frequent, or those are things that you care about because you're invested in them. If you don't go to the different neighborhoods, if you don't know the woman who is helping this community and has been doing it for years, Ira said it's the default. That's what you're invested in. And I find as a woman, I've never had the luxury of only being invested in things that I care about. I've always learned about other cultures. I've always had to be invested in what others are doing, but as the majority, or sometimes as, you know, if you're a white person, you may not have to know or care about what another culture is doing because that is not majority rules, but it has to be it has to be intentional for you to care about those things. I can't tell you, and this is something that has happened a lot with journalists. I can't tell you how many times I've read a story about a popular rock artist who has passed away. I'm going to read that story like I listened to all of his albums, but I don't know this man. And there was one time I did tell a coworker, not here, but that I didn't know who that was. And he's like, what, are you crazy? And I'm like, well, do you know who Anita Baker is? You know, so it's just that kind of things that can't matter to me. You don't know about, and I don't think you're crazy, but why am I crazy? Because I don't know who this legend was, you know, cultural legend. So I think it's those things that really speak to that implicit bias.
I could continue this conversation all day. I'm being told that we have to wrap up here so we can get to the next panel. But thank you to Ashley, thank you to Kevin. Miss Dorothy, I'm putting you on the panel now. Thank you to you. Thank you to Tim. Thank you to Jamila. Thank you to Whitney. And thank you to Rob for waking up very early to share your valuable, valuable insight. I owe each of you a drink, coffee, lunch, something. We're going to make it happen. Thank you guys again.
I'm going to hold you to that. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to hold you to that.
So I too want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you, Kyle, for facilitating such a fabulous conversation with journalists. We so appreciate and value the contributions. And thank you, each of the panelists, as well as Dorothy jumping in, being a part of the panelists. And thank you all for serving our community with such excellence. So now I'm here to introduce Denisha Porter. She is actually a friend and a colleague. She is executive director of All In Cincinnati, and she's going to introduce her guests. I just want to say about Denisha, though, she's been with All In Cincinnati just a little bit more than 2 years. I met her when she first started. She came with a coalition building experience, and man, has she built a coalition from community activists to legislators, and now she's executive director of All In Cincinnati. So with that, Denisha, thank you. Welcome to the panelists.
Thank you so much, Diane, and good morning to all. I am super excited to be here with you today, and it is my honor to introduce Iris Rowley and Jennifer Ingram, who are both All In Cincinnati Equity Coalition core team members. Iris Rowley is a community activist and has championed the collaborative agreement for over 20 years. And Jennifer Ingram is a DE&I consultant with racial equity expertise. So we will hop right into this because I love your excitement, Iris. I love it, love it, love it. So we only have 20 minutes, and I know you guys both have a lot of wisdom to share. So let's hop right into it. Iris, first question.
What's happening?
What are 3 pieces of advice you could provide on working effectively with Cincinnati's Black community, especially Black women?
Okay, so let me just say this, because my ancestors told me to be honest and be truthful this morning. So Iris Rowley is not just an activist. She's a taxpayer. She's a wife, she's a mother. She owns a business of 20 years in this particular town that has changed not just Cincinnati, but the world as it relates to police community relations. So I must say that, because if I don't speak my own truth, nobody else will. And oftentimes, Black media will mimic what majority media teaches us. Conditioning is a powerful tool. Just taking the shackles off your ankles does not mean the shackles is not still on your mind. So we have to continuously work on that. So I have to pump Iris Rowley, because I don't know if I just like being called an activist. Repeat your question for me, Ms. Denisha, please, one more time.
Well, you already gave us one piece of advice.
Get it right.
But basically, give us 3 pieces of advice for working with Cincinnati's Black community, especially Black women.
Oh my goodness, especially Black women. You know, Black women have carried America. So understand our power and our gifts and our truths as we come to the table. Stop trying to push us down and subjugate us to the minimal roles. Our brains are vast. As I said, we have contributed to America and this world in ways that people will not even recognize. That's 1. 2, open the door. Allow the door to be open in a way that Black women can walk in. I heard Miss Ashley when she said someone told her that she was crazy. Oftentimes Black women, we are characterized as aggressive because we want equity. We're often characterized as mad or angry because we are mad and angry. I'm still mad about enslavement and the residuals of. So people get mad at us about being mad about the way we've been treated and about the way that we can see in the future that our children will be treated and our grandchildren will be treated. So if you see us that we're mad, do something about that madness and stop getting stuck at the mad. The 3rd thing I would advise people to do is to understand that we do run businesses. We can contribute to changing policies, procedures, and guidelines. We can run newspapers. We can do all of it, and we certainly have.
Thanks, Iris. So Jennifer, the same question.
So Iris, I appreciate you paving the way. I also just want to stand in my truth and my fullness. I'm a business owner. I lead a boutique equity and inclusion consulting firm based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, but we're a global firm called Calibrated Lens. I also own a real estate investment company offering high quality, affordable housing named 3011 Whitney. 3011 Whitney was the address of the first piece of property my great grandparents owned after fleeing racial terrorism in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, becoming refugees in Detroit, Michigan, and staying in a one-room apartment for 2 years to save up enough money to purchase 3011 Whitney, which was also a duplex where they offered high quality, affordable housing to others in the community. So that's a little bit about myself. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. I think it's also important to highlight signals of inclusion, and that is one that you might model moving forward. So Denisha, 3 things that I would recommend. I took some time in framing this in the way as follows. One is the personal or individual work that we can do, right? And I'll go a bit deeper around those things. The second are the structural things that we might do in our organizations, within our institutions. And the third, social, right? How can we broaden our lens and understand the fullness of experiences? And so personally realizing, I heard a lot of folks talk about training. Training in isolation is insufficient at producing the desired outcomes. And so I wanna start just by saying that is a first step to expand your awareness of where there could be issues, where you might have blind spots, but realize that that is not the end. Also, understanding the way that your biases, so we all have biases, but more concretely, understanding your individual biases. You can take the Harvard Implicit Association Test, IAT, to understand your biases. And as you expand your understanding, trace those lines back to understand how those biases were formed. And as a basis of understanding how those biases are formed, look at the stereotypes and the narratives that we hold about individuals, about communities, based on those biases. And so those are a few things that we can do as individuals. And as you expand your own awareness, inclusion starts with I. Understanding your own lived experience, your own racial identity, and the ways in which that impacts the way that you move through the world. I heard a lot of folks talk about in the last panel, their own identity and those experiences. But oftentimes we check those things outside of the door of our institutions because it's not safe. We have this generalization that safety is a universal extension, but realizing that safety is actually very individualized and it is relative. Same thing with trust. So those are a couple of things for the personal. Structural, which stories are newsworthy and who is determining those that are newsworthy? And earlier they talked about, naming racism. I would expand that to say naming isms explicitly, naming phobias explicitly, naming hate crimes explicitly. When we're talking about racism, also highlighting anti-Black sentiments and the ways in which that impacts and transforms not only things through a racialized lens, but how we're applying that to so many things subconsciously and unintentionally, right? I don't think that it's folks setting out with, ill will. It's benign. However, the impacts are harsh and they are harmful to communities. The second that I would love to talk about are, just social, right? Broadening your lens, and no pun intended, calibrate your lens, right? Expand beyond your own lived experience and how you view the world to understand stereotypes. And so it moves beyond saying that is a stereotype and realizing that what that looks like in practice and what that looks like in film and what that looks like on the news is not a universal knowledge. And so taking that time to understand what are stereotypes and how are these things harmful? What are the connections? Not just stopping and saying, oh, that's a stereotype, but actually doing the work and understanding what those things look like, and also framing narratives, moving beyond this victimization or bootstrap mentality and how we convey stories, and instead using asset-based framing. There are assets in all communities, and we talk about data, not just stopping at the figures, but back mapping to understand the social structures and the conditions that contribute to the numbers that we see.
Woo!
Did you say back mapping?
Yes.
Back mapping. Okay, so you gotta expand on the back mapping part, because I'm following you, Jen. So
yes.
Explain to the crowd what you mean by back mapping, please.
Jen, really quickly before you explain, we're just getting started and you two are amazing, but go ahead.
Thank you. So it's actually a motto from the Racial Equity Institute. And looking at what that looks like is, all right, we know that there are inequities in education. And starting with the figure, what we oftentimes hear in the news is this percentage of Black students graduated or didn't graduate. But let's go a step further. What are the home conditions of those students based on zip code? When we look at zip codes and how they define outcomes in educational attainment, but more fully looking at the experience, going back a step further to understand what are the conditions that those parents are having and how they are raising their children, but going a step further, looking at the structures, right? So what type of access to employment, what type of access to high quality education exists, what are the social or the communal assets, but then also what are the structural barriers that are impeding opportunity for folks to be able to achieve or accomplish those things. And so when we look at low graduation rates, I know that there's been a lot of work done in this region to increase graduation rates. But when we started in framing that narrative, that we talk about all the rich assets that our young folks had, and then also understand the backstories of these individuals and of the communities and the structural and institutional impediments that existed in those ways.
Jen just talked, and Denisha, I know you're going to ask us a question, but there's one small example I want to put in here for people to back map on. And that's why I asked you to define what you meant about that term in case people were not clear about what that meant or the process. And we should be okay with not knowing, because we are human beings and we should live our lives as ever learning individuals so that we can become the people that we often say that we want to see. But there's another characteristic that has just been put on Black women, which is insane: single mothers. So when you hear, we say it, and everyone says it, even Black people, and we say it as if though it can't occur, as if a mother of a child could lose a spouse or a significant other, and that person ends up being the only adult taking care of that child. Now, is that wrong? No, that's life. Stuff happens. Excuse me. I hope there are no kids on here. Stuff happens. But for Black women who have children, we first are put in the category as being a single mom. And so thus when we show up with dads or significant others or partners in our relationships, they're not considered, right? So we're not even seen as a whole family. And that's the first characteristic, as if being a single mom is such a bad thing, and as if non-Black women cannot be single moms, right? And so when that's just placed upon us, it comes with a negative connotation that either our children don't have fathers or significant others or communities to help raise them. And so when we perpetuate these things, and when you just hear that, a small statement like single parenting, because you have to understand that language matters. And then that language goes further into what Jen just described as the back mapping. What's that individual's backstory? You don't know. But to define an individual based on that one word, and then define the whole family based on that one characteristic, is what gets us in these conundrums that we're in today.
Iris,
Are you gonna say something, Jen? All right, we only got 8 minutes left. But go ahead, Jen.
I just wanted to circle back to that. We are not inviting people to define themselves and the labels that they want to carry. We ascribe labels oftentimes to individuals based on social constructs. And it's also important to invite people to self-identify and let them lead with how they would like to, what labels they would like to carry. Or if you're working on a story, ask folks, what would you like for the tagline to be in the story? What are the assets or the things that you would like to highlight about yourself, about your experience, to ensure that it's not being misrepresented or exploited? So that was the only other piece that I just wanted to expand on.
I love you, Jennifer. I love you, girl.
Iris, really quickly, what makes you say yes or no to an interview request from a reporter?
It depends on the reporter and how they've reported before. I'm not new to this, I'm true to this. And so, especially in the area in Ohio, across the nation. So it depends on how they report and who they report on. And then what's the content of their reporting? Not everybody gets to talk to Iris Rowley. You don't get the pleasure of hearing my wisdom, my fight, and my struggle if you don't talk about my people in an appropriate way, or if my story won't be represented in an appropriate way. I've done many stories that you think that people are going to report accurately, but by the time it hits the byline, hits the newspaper, the print hits the paper, it's a total different thing. Oh, Iris Rowley is anti-police. Well, what I am is anti-police brutality. I'm against bad policing. I'm against not getting a return on my tax dollar, return on my investment. People don't believe that Black people pay taxes where they live. We do on multiple levels. And so we want the same systematic things in the correct, appropriate way that everybody else does. So that'll get me, that'll get you a no or yay. Depends on who you are and what you've been saying and how you've been saying it.
Thanks, Iris. Jen, same question to you.
I appreciate your responses, Iris, and I want to say, I want to build on. I agree with so many of the things that you referenced. What is your position? And in times of conflict, did you take a side? And understanding that we all are, expected to have or anchor our approach, our views and values. What are the values that you all have or possess as an institution, and of the individuals that are actively interviewing or engaging in stories? What are those values and how do they shine through? And what cultural sensitivities do you have in ways that you're speaking to me or engaging with me? So often we talk about communities as if they are a spokesperson on behalf of. And so if you are expecting me to be a token or to tokenize my comments on behalf of a community, I'm gonna decline respectfully. Beyond the tokenization, if we are not getting down into the nuances of identity and understanding the complexities of us as individuals. And so, Iris, you started in that way, but also understanding that no group is a monolith. And so not only are you asking me about my Blackness, you're asking me about my queerness. You're asking me about my experience as a woman operating or navigating through this world. And so if there are parts of my identity that are in conflict with the values of your institution or your personal values, again, I will politely, decline and know that my intellectual labor is not something that is exploited for the purpose of the gain of ratings and to be picked and probed apart. Realizing that as we talk about our experiences and share dimensions of ourselves with you, it is a gift. And embracing that as a gift that is appreciated and valued, not chopped down and distilled to what you would like it to be.
Thank you, Jennifer.
That's just straight fire.
And then, so I'm going to go back to you, Jennifer, really quickly. This is our last question. We have 4 minutes, so maybe 2 minutes each. Have you had an experience when you felt misrepresented? Could you tell us about that?
Absolutely. I think I alluded to it in the last question, right? And knowing that I am not just a soundbite. There have been moments where, I might sit down and have a 2-hour conversation, and what you come up with is the most, I don't even, I'm not going to go into the nuances, but I have felt extremely offended by and exploited in that process. And so how can you value individuals and be trustworthy, right? If I don't trust you, know that you may not get the fullness of a story. And so how can you learn ways and tactics to understand and center the voice of the individual, but also earn the trust of the individual that you are in coming into a conversation with?
Sometimes it is, and it's, Denisha, thank you for that question. And, again, I've been around a long time, been in many rooms with many folk who don't appreciate the gift of strong Black women who fight. Oftentimes folk will say, Iris Rowley, you're equivalent to Harriet Tubman, and I take that role very seriously. And so, I might have to come in with my 45 to let you know that I am here to free my people, whether it's from your tyranny or some other systems that are not working for us. And oftentimes people will mischaracterize that fight, that struggle that people like Jennifer and myself and the rest of the Black women who are on the front line bring, and we'll try to mischaracterize our efforts and mischaracterize how we get it done. I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a badass. I've changed the city of Cincinnati, changed the world. I hang out with some strong Black women, and we continuously pump each other up. And so we refuse to bow down to anything less. So that's how I handle that, if that was your question, Denisha.
Thank you so much.
Jennifer fires me up.
I know. She does the same for me too. And we actually did it in 20 minutes. So I applaud both of you guys. So Diane, do I turn it back over to you?
Well, I don't know. Well, we can't get another question in from these two in 1 minute, so we will just.
Come on with it. We can do 1 minute. We can do it. We can do it.
I'm sitting over here hollering and clapping and, you know, shouting and all
I know
of that.
both of y'all well. Y'all ain't answering nothing in a minute. Okay?
I promise you, we can do it. We can do it. Can't we, Jennifer? We can do it.
No, they can't.
I love
In fact,
you both dearly, but I know y'all ain't doing nothing in a minute.
No, and we just spent a minute having this part of the conversation. So thank you so much, Iris and Jennifer. We are so grateful for what you do in the community. Thank you for this wisdom. I mean, you all were just snapping some wisdom in the last 20 minutes. So thank you for all that you do. I'm now going to turn it over to Barbara. Barbara, Kyle, and Denisha are going to wrap up for our time today. So thank you all so very, very much.
And so Kyle, do you want to go first? Would you like me to go first? How do you?
My fault. I thought Barbara was going first. I apologize. A big thank you again to everyone for coming out here today. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone who signed on early this morning. None of this would have been possible without all of you. I want to let you guys know. So the access to the database list is going to come via email. The moment that we are done with this, you should get an email from the YWCA with a link to that database. And then at some point next week, we are then going to drop off some physical copies to each of your newsrooms. This is a living document. It may be updated periodically, but please use this. Start using it next week. I know we're all in November sweeps for the television people. This is a great way for you to expand on some of your pieces that you're going to be working on in the coming days. Give us some feedback. If you have names that you would like to see added, shoot me an email. It's on the Local 12 website. You can message me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Give us feedback. Let us know what you're thinking about the source list. I could not have this moment without giving a shout out to GCABJ and encouraging every journalist to join GCABJ. We are a professional advocacy organization. We do a lot of amazing things, and it's not just for Black journalists. That is our primary focus, but we obviously welcome anyone who would like to come. But again, thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to everyone who put this together, especially Carolyn.
And I'll just ditto that. Thank you to all of the planning committee members. Thank you to the panelists, Iris and Jennifer, and all the other panelists that presented earlier today. And just really quickly wanted to mention exactly what All in Cincinnati is. It's a racial equity coalition, and we're working to dismantle racial inequities in 5 priority areas: health, housing, education, economic mobility, and justice, with a goal to uplift and elevate Black women in Hamilton County. So thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this discussion today, and I look forward to partnering with you in the future. And I will turn it over to Barbara.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Barbara Perez. I'm the president and CEO of the YWCA. And wow, this has been a super powerful conversation. So thank you to everyone. But I want to once again remind all of our participants, Diane started off with it, and I think it's important for our closing to remind you of our mission once again. So it's to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And that for all part is really important. So we, meaning the YWCA Greater Cincinnati, we want to be a resource for all of you on areas of racial justice and equity for all. So issues affecting our Black citizens, of course, but others too. So our Muslim, Hispanic, Sikh, Jewish, LGBTQ friends, and others, as Diane also shared earlier. And so while we've begun with the resources that Kyle talked about, including men and women who are Black, as we said, we'll be expanding our list over the months ahead and providing that all to all of you as we do it. So the YWCA Greater Cincinnati has long been a trusted resource for domestic violence. And it's another big area of our work. And we will continue to be available as a credible resource for this, of course. But we've also been doing more in the area of racial justice and advocating for women's empowerment. We've been doing that for over 150 years. So as we continue to do this work and expand it, we want to be a partner with you to make sure that we are being intentionally inclusive in all reporting, and that we really want you to have the resources to reflect our entire community, especially since it's constantly changing. As has been said, but it is important to emphasize, it is imperative to include all people of color. And now I think it's really important to thank all of our partners in this training, all in Cincinnati. Thank you, Denisha, the Greater Cincinnati Association of Black Journalists. Thank you, Kyle, especially Kyle, who's done a lot of work on preparing for us today. And thank you to our co-hosts, Diane Jordan, YWCA Board Chair, and Curtis Fuller. I also want to thank our panelists. The panel was so insightful. I'm sure you all agree. The facilitators, participants, and YWCA staff. And a very big thank you to Carolyn Michele. She is our YWCA board member who has led this effort brilliantly. We are most grateful for all your work, Carolyn. This certainly exceeded my expectations. I don't know about you, but it really did today. And you all brought your A game, so thank you. You all showed up here today. So thank you, participants, for being with us today and taking time out of your really busy lives to listen, lean in, and learn. And please remember, if you take nothing else away from the last hour and a half, if you do not intentionally include, you unintentionally exclude. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all.